This is another meditation Q&A, and I'm just waiting a few minutes for Wendy to arrive. That's the plan anyway, and go live on Instagram. And it looks like it's okay to go live on Instagram now. And yeah, so today we have this topic of fear and courage. And let me just read the description here. In this 24th installment of the ongoing live series with Wendy Nash, inquiring into meditation practice on and off the cushion, we plan to explore fear and courage. What are the pros and cons of fear and courage? How much is too much and how much is enough? How are these best viewed and worked with in meditation and in daily life? Well, hey, Ms. Reed, how's it going? Got your comment here in the studio and restream. Well, I don't know where Wendy's at, but it's definitely different without her. So I just got to get started here. Well, for one thing, if we're in a situation like this when we have expectations, right, and they don't get fulfilled, is there? Well, likely there's a kind of disappointment right off the bat, and then that disappointment can potentially turn into, I don't know, agitation. The mind can really spin out all over the place. It can say, well, did I do anything? I wonder what's going on. Is everything okay? And then some people can jump into fear, I imagine, like they call it catastrophizing. But where does all this start to begin with? And I would say the expectation itself, right? So having expectations that, things will just happen this way, but we know that life is uncertain, right? So is there an alternative to doing, to living without expectation? Now, this is not to say that there's not goals, that we have goals, or we just kind of have a general sense of how things operate. But then we have, I think there's a couple kinds of expectations. There's things that operate in the background that we're not really aware of, that we just kind of assume and take for granted that will be there and happen a certain way. And this is kind of based on habit patterns and just past experience, right? Unless something very strange happens, we just kind of assume certain things will be the way they are. But that's not the case either. And then there's the more insidious kind where we have to have something a certain way or it's not okay. And those are the ones that are more easily worked with. Yes, discernment, absolutely. And that the wisdom to know the difference, to discern between things. Yeah. Corrupt says, is probably not an appropriate comment here. She hasn't showed up yet. Okay, so fear and courage. I know that at least for me, fear was a huge thing during the lockdowns, right? And it seems like a lot of this has been completely forgot about. What happened during the lockdowns, and Ms. Reed says, before I get to that, Ms. Reed says, real-time presence, not being too strict. Yeah, this is really important. So having an openness to meet something with openness, as long as our boundaries are being respected, right? Meeting something with openness and being present for it instead of already living in the future about a potential result, or our expectations are getting our expectations met in the future, already living there, right? And then we don't arrive there, then we can be disappointed in all the other things that happen. The spiritual question, how am I when things don't go my way? It's a really good question. Okay, so the but yeah, in the best way to meet that is with presence in the present moment, if we can, right? Fears during the lockdowns. This is controversial, and wherever you fall on the kind of divide or the things that people were kind of pushed into during this time, you're either this camp or that camp. Both camps, I think, were under a tremendous amount of fear. And yeah, that I find was kind of the most dangerous thing about it. As we know, fear can really run down the immune system too. I've got this quote I found from Jimmy Stewart. Fear is an insidious and deadly thing. It can warp judgment, freeze reflexes, breed mistakes. Worse, it's contagious. So I don't know. I guess it could be an insidious and deadly thing. I don't know how far that's pushing it. Warp judgment, yeah. Usually, when we're in a fear state, we don't have access to our highest wisdom. Freezes reflexes, we know that from the fight, flight, or freeze, and it can breed mistakes. We're not really concerned about kind of having integrity and operating in a way that's safe and, I don't know, conducive, thorough to how we usually operate. So mistakes are okay, but I don't think that's what he's referring to here. And then the contagion of fear, that's an interesting one. I don't know if science can prove that one, but I wonder if we can actually see that in our daily lives, right? If you have a boat full of people, you just have more and more people in fear, but it can be the opposite too. You can have one courageous person, and then that can be inspiring for another, and then eventually there's a tipping point, and that tipping point can be can change. So now, how all the dynamics of that work, I'm not entirely sure. Donald Kinsella says, I found lockdown comforting. The state took control in a time of year and chaos. Um, in a time of fear and chaos. Okay. Well, Donald, I'm interested in knowing what part of the world you're in. And, this is a good point too. So the lockdowns weren't obviously all bad. I think a lot of good came from these in the sense that a lot of people were forced to look at themselves, look at their habit patterns, and go inside themselves and say, okay, I can't keep going on the way I've been going on. Now I'm confronted with not doing the things I usually do. So this sent a lot of people into soul searching. I'm sure it sent some people into internal crisis. I guess some people might have gotten, of course, this is all conjecture, right? I didn't have a thorough scientific examination or scientific poll asking people. This is just from my what I observed a little bit and heard other people say. Some people, might have got completely lazy and just said, "Okay, screw this. I'm just gonna sit on the couch all day and eat potato chips. Who cares? Life outside is hard. I'm just gonna, who cares?" And everywhere in between. So yes, and this is a notion Donald brings up of responsibility, right? Sometimes, yes, things can get very chaotic, and we don't want the responsibility of making hard decisions, and so we have other people do that. And sometimes some of us are in a state where we the decisions we make, they have dire consequence, and they could lead to really hard repercussions, and it's just easier to have someone else make those choices. And I think that's totally okay if we're out of our league, out of our, if it's out of our ballpark, out of our wheelhouse. At the same time, I have to encourage self-responsibility. We have to look inside and say, no one else is responsible for my actions. What am I going to do? Yes, we were put in a certain situation where we kind of had limited capacity for operating in the world in certain regards. compared to what we were used to. However, there are some people out there that tested the waters, and that took a lot of courage because, as we saw overnight, the kind of entire world population was locked down. We never even saw that coming before. I could have not imagined my wildest dreams how quickly the state of the world changed overnight. Now, I also saw a lot of people that were taking that courage too far and were bad mouthing people, blaming, shaming, acting in inappropriate ways, not really having concern for themselves' safety because their freedom and independence felt violated. So I saw a lot of misbehavior in that camp as well. So it's really a complex issue, and I think this has all been swept under the rug pretty much, and we don't really have. It's not encouraged to really kind of process and debrief and talk about the social situations, the internal situations, psychological situations, social situations, all this stuff. So I'll go back to the comments here. Donald says, I am in Ireland. We had one of the most strict lockdowns in the world. It was also prolonged than elsewhere. Okay, thanks, Donald. Miss Reed says, lockdown was a created fear. They made it so we could face our fear. It's like they create the chaos to create the peace solution. Okay, so this one, yeah, there's some people that talk about problem, reaction, solution. And if you're not familiar with this, I'll just mention it real briefly. And I'm not saying this is a scientifically proven thing, but there's some people that claim, drawing on history and looking at certain situations, that a problem is actually artificially created. And I'm not saying this was or not. I'm just saying this is a template that some people claim has been used. And then reaction is that then people will react for that. They'll say, "Oh, this is so horrible. We want something done about it. Somebody has to do something about this." And then the solution, which actually went along with the problem. So the solution was actually in place before the problem was even instigated. And so they used the reaction saying, "Oh, you want something to do about it? Well, then jump in here, and here, we've got the solution for you." And so this is how they kind of, it said this is how they kind of control how they do things. And Wendy just texted me. I'm glad I texted her, and I'll just say it's okay. Come on in. All right. And then Donald says, let me just finish with Miss Reed's comment here. Lockdown was created fear. They made it so we could face our fear. It's like they create the chaos to create the peace solution. Well, I think that's a great way to look at it too. Hey, Wendy, how's it going?
I'm so sorry. I saw.
Oh, I
I,
don't have your voice. I can't hear
Give me
you.
one second.
Oh, can't hear you. Can you hear me? Um, check your audio. Oh, actually, that's funny. Never mind. Okay, say something again. I can hear
Here we
you.
are.
Yeah, I
There
can
we
hear
are.
you. Yes.
I'm so sorry. I had it in my mind that it would be starting in 45 minutes' time, and I was on a phone call and I was having a lovely chat with somebody I didn't know, and
Yeah,
I just lost time. I'm so sorry.
it's okay.
But look at how many comments you've got.
I
You've
know.
got
Right.
more than in usual. Hi,
Yes.
Ms.
Yeah.
Reed.
So we got right into the lockdowns, and Donald says, or well, let me address, if it's okay, Wendy. I'll just address Miss Reed's here. So she says the lockdown created fear. They made it so we can face our fear. It's like they create the chaos to create the peace solution. And I love this shift of perspective. Instead of some people saying that, it was actually planned and they create fear and control people, I can see that perspective too. But why not make the best of it, like Miss Reed says, and turn it back and say, okay, well, now we have an opportunity to practice with fear. What am I going to do about it? It's here. People are afraid. I'm afraid. I remember there was a 2 month kind of a period during the whole thing where it was like peak fear for me, and it was just off the charts. And it was a great time to practice, and meditation practice helped me quite a bit with that. So it was, really, I could see that run down the immune system, like I said earlier. And Donald says, I feared COVID. I didn't have the education to question it. I needed state experts to advise me. Well, that's an interesting one. Like I say, I refrain from commenting about this whole thing on a scientific level because to feel confident, I would need to know microbiology, immunology, virology, and genetics. And I don't know any of those things. So I looked at kind of the mainstream camp, and then I looked at the alternative science camp. And yeah, let's just keep it there. I don't want to get political, and I know we don't want to mention certain words on this because we potentially still get censored on YouTube. I want to kind of focus on the thing that we can address here, and that's more the kind of meditative psychological aspect of fear and courage, because the other thing is just way above my pay grade. So that's why we're going to kind of mention the fear and courage that we can. So Wendy, how did you deal with all this during those times, and how did your meditation practice come into it?
So I was in Western Sydney, in an area called Blacktown, and it was one of the most lockdown areas in Australia. Not because Melbourne had more lockdowns than where I was. I I felt, for me, I appreciated the lockdowns. I wasn't going to work, so it wasn't a problem. And I actually just felt that somebody was more interested in my well-being than they were about making a lot of money. And so for me, I felt reassured by by the lockdowns. It wasn't particularly pleasant. I wanted to go out like everybody. I guess I'm a homebody, but I have um I think that for me, I would rather feel that somebody is interested in my well-being and take that perspective. That
You
to
know,
me is really important. Yeah, and for that's my well-being. One of the things I've been thinking about is social anxiety and how, we get caught in this, I feel judged and I am the judge, and then there's this social anxiety that sits between the two of those that causes this huge conversation about what will people think of me. And it is difficult to know how to respond. And I basically think that whatever we did during the pandemic was stuff that we do anyway, but just on a more magnified level. So it is a really good opportunity. I think I've mentioned another time in one of our conversations ages ago where I was living in another country and I was finding it really hard to make friends. And so I just decided that I would do lots of Dharma study, lots of practice, really engage with it. And I was, it wasn't a particularly happy time, but it was a time where I could really work with my mind. And it helped me not only then, but much later. So I I found it, you know, I recently was thinking about it, and I can't remember if I talked about this last time, Josh, but I realized that, so as a child, I was locked in my room. My parents had this very old fashioned way of thinking about punishment. Well, if you just lock somebody in their room, you aren't hitting them. So it's not violence. So they just were raised in a different era. And I realize now that I could go anywhere in that room, but I could never leave that room. And but I still had freedom to move within that room. And I think the way that we live our lives now is that we have freedom to move within our room, which is our mind, but we can never escape out of that until we have done the inquiry and until we have looked at the voices, our social anxieties that keep us caged in.
Yeah, wow. That's a huge thing. So we've got the care or perceived care during the lockdowns, and then I want to touch on that briefly, and then this notion of how basically our childhood kind of condition plays a conditionality, and especially the specifics you mentioned. So you know, I wonder about this, Wendy, and it's okay. What I think if these officials, I really think there's a lot of good people in officialdom, but there's also a lot of bad apples, as we know, right? And so what I think happened, regardless of that, because I know that, or it seems to be that a lot of the companies, certain companies, made a lot of money during this, and a lot of smaller businesses, from what I understand, at least in the states, actually got pushed out during this. So that aside, what it did though is it gave people a container, like you're saying, to then go inward and offer a reinforcement of whatever was perceived there as care, right? So you perceived that as care. And some people perceived it differently. Some people perceived it as I'm kind of subject to tyranny. I've got one group of people saying, one group of adults saying, you can't, I'm in control now. You have to do what we say because of X, Y, and Z, be it legitimate or not, right? So either way, my heart is warmed by the fact that you felt nourished and had the opportunity to do that. And I'm glad that so many people did, actually, that so many people did find it helpful. And I did too, because like you say, Wendy just demonstrated that she had been prepared early on for something like this to happen. So it didn't seem like a huge change for you. Same way with me. I didn't go out and do a bunch of things. I was just kind of going to the grocery store, going to parks, and I was still able to walk in my neighborhood safely too. And and I actually traveled a little bit because it was allowed, and there wasn't hardly anybody at the airport, right? And it was really inexpensive. Of course, it was within America at the time. So that's there, that we have, these different perceptions about what happened, and that we can provide ourselves with that nourishment too. And then we can, like Wendy was saying, we can draw on these perceptions of our caregivers, right? Be they wherever they may be, whether they be closer to us, um, uh, you know, this notion of calling on our spiritual entourage, right? These people we really respect, that are kind of spiritual mentors, and we can draw on their kind of kindness and wisdom, with perceptions, and wherever that may be, these support systems. Now, the things Wendy's talking about as a child and punishment, I had the kind of the exact opposite, where I was in a rural area and I roamed around and was never really made to go to my room and so much, but I was spanked, and unfortunately, it was. I would never advise that as a parenting technique to anyone. Unfortunately, it was still kind of common back in that era. I wouldn't call it abuse, but maybe it was. But I would say the more challenging thing was the emotional aspect coming up in the world. It's family life can be hard for some. And schooling and social situations is even harder for a lot of people. And I know that social anxiety was quite a thing. And I don't think it's totally uncommon, especially when people are coming of age. I think it's quite a common thing, actually, when we're coming of age. In this social thing, we're always worried about where we fit in, and being introverted like I was, not really wanting to interact and engage with the world. And I don't, and some people even look down at that. They say, oh, they're so introverted, like it's some kind of bad thing. And I don't think it necessarily has to be either. And especially to judge and blame yourself for being how you are, I don't find that very helpful either. So, but this notion that Wendy talks about, and I think it's a good metaphor too for meditation practice, of kind of, yeah, you look out there in the world, right? And kind of, okay, is this it? Is this all there is, right? By the time you're in your 20s, you kind of have a bead on a lot of the world in the sense of the regularities of life. You know, you've got the work, the relationship, the house, you know, eat, sleep, repeat, basically. And, you know, and maybe you take a break and then you go on vacation and then you do it all over. And for some people, that works great. I'm not knocking that in particular. But for me, I was just like, that's it, really? There's got to be more than that. And it wasn't until I started going in, you know, that realized, oh no, that's not all there is. There's so much more to this experience, this heart, this mind, this body complex. So
Yeah. One thing I would say is that your response to the pandemic, I think, is also greatly culturally driven, and also a disposition to how you respond to authority. So, if
yes.
you tend to be defiant of authority, the lockdowns will be experienced as, um, you know, enforced lockdown. But for somebody who perhaps has a more compliant personality, then actually maybe that's not going to be a problem. So it just depends, I think, on how you see authority figures. I thought it was a really good opportunity to look at your own mind. As it happens, I wrote to our state premier in New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, who was the governor at the time during the pandemic. And I just wrote to her and the head of the Department of Health, and just said, you must have your bodies must you must be really tired by now, because it had been going on by this stage for what, a year and a half or something. I said, you just must be all really exhausted, working all the time, having to think about this emergency meetings, and just to say thank you to you and the team for just doing your best in these very extenuating circumstances. And I got a reply back, and actually the premier had written, thank you, Wendy, dear Wendy, as opposed to dear Ms. Nash. And thank you for your kind words. They just appreciated the kindness of my sentiments, that they too were human. They too are human.
Yeah, it's really important, Wendy. And even though, you know, yes, I would say that I have been challenged with authority, but what I did see during this time for that camp, and I mentioned this earlier before you came on, there was a lot of misbehavior. There was a lot of unnecessary defiance in the wrong ways, right? I'm all for people speaking out and questioning things and speaking power to authority, but it needs to be done in a kind way. Otherwise, it's not going to be helpful. Otherwise, it's going to feed into the same thing that they're actually trying to address. Um, I until I actually meet someone in power, it's basically speculation. Until I sit down and have a meal with them or chat with them, it is kind of like this. Figure that I see in the media, and that's it. So I love Wendy's thing with this. So regardless of their knowledge of what was going on, how much classified information they might have had to know what was possibly going on behind the scenes, how much potential money they may have been making. I'm not accusing anybody. I'm just saying, hypothetically, for people in power, the corruption that some have or some are faced with. Regardless of all that, I feel that it's best to take the high road in any of this regard. How do we speak to power? Well, of course, like Wendy says, not only is Wendy respectful, but she's kind, right? And she realizes that they are too a living being, and that they're deserving at the very least of dignity. And it's so great to see Wendy's default of kindness and respect and honor. And I know I still have a lot to learn with that when it comes to certain authority figures. And yeah, go ahead.
So I actually have quite a lot, which I guess we're changing tack about from fear, because you have to be. I
Oh
think
yeah.
we fear we fear something that is bigger than us, that we don't have resources for. So, and I think authority is often that sort of place. I actually have now quite a lot to do with politicians, and I meet them at council, which is our municipality, our town, and Um, I have a lot to do with the police minister here in my state, and I have a lot to do with the federal member. And they're just people. They're just people. And some of them I warm to more readily, but some of them I have more challenges with, you know. But what I see is that actually, when you have a walled heart, that makes you hard. So your heart is a wall. So if you're a politician who likes to build walls against certain people to keep some people in and some people out, that is, we were talking, my husband and I, we were talking about how that reflects the hardness of the heart, how much the heart has been walled around. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, and we don't know why that is. Some people have harder hearts. But I think that babies come into this world, generally speaking, with a lot of a lot of love, a lot of kindness. And these people, by the time I meet my councillors and my elected representatives, they're what, 30, 40, 45, 50, 55, whatever. They're the same age as me, certainly, and they have history, and we are all wounded. So I'm always really curious about how can I work with not the behavior that is acted out, but how can I see the person who is wounded? That's always my goal. That's my goal. And how can I love that person who has been wounded? Because, what does it say in, the quote from the Dhammapada? Hatred never ceases, is never ceased by hatred. Only love will cure hatred. What's the correct phrase? Do you
No,
know?
yeah, that's right. There's different interpretations. The ones I like is, hate. Yeah, hatred never ceases by hatred. Only love can. Or the other one I like is ill will can never overcome ill will. Only non ill will can overcome ill will. This is an eternal and ancient law. It's just like Martin Luther King's basically said the same thing, right? He said something like, oh, I forget now the quote, but it's very similar to that. And it really is, if we think that we're going to have, we see all this stuff in the world and we think that we're going to try to overcome it with the same energy, it's just not going to work. It doesn't. We have to, it's a vicious cycle. It's this victim victimizer, bully victim, and then hoping for a hero. But no, we have to break that cycle and change the energy, change it into one of non ill will. And that's the only way that vicious cycle I feel can stop. And it's so great, Wendy, that you have interface and local politicians. I guess what I was thinking of, this kind of force, like in Washington, right? This machine, this political machine. And that I don't know how it works in Australia, but this money that's behind them, because they're just kind of bought and paid for by lots and lots of money. That's, as far as I know, these super PACs, they're anonymous. We don't even know where the money comes from, who their paymasters are, who they're beholden to. And I feel that a lot of them get in there for really good reasons. And then if they want to continue there, they kind of have to play ball. Now, I'm oversimplifying. I'm not saying that's always the case. And I saw some interesting stories and comments by a few congressmen and women too. But for the most part, I personally don't get involved in politics, especially on that level. But I'm heartened to see Wendy's cause, and that she's actually going with people that she can meet. It's not some face on a screen that we can't have access to. She's pretty much embedded with politicians, and seeing them as human beings, and interfacing to work with them for her causes. And yeah, so that's different. But the most important thing here is what Wendy said, is this trauma, this woundedness. We'll just call it, I like that word, woundedness, instead of trauma. Trauma almost seems kind of clinical and maybe not apply to me because that's too severe or something like that, right? But this woundedness, having our heart ache, quiver, hurt, and then even on the most subtle levels, this I like this notion of there's a thing in the suttas, like a poem, one of the few poems that Buddha wrote, I think, or is attributed to that. There's like a thorn lodged deep in the heart that's difficult to discern. And once we can get to that thorn in the heart, then we can have more ease and peace. We can wander in more ease and peace, and we can settle down with more ease and peace. And it really is kind of a liberation of the heart. I like this notion of the heart's true release, as a kind of the synonym for liberation and enlightenment, this type of thing, because it really is, we're kind of releasing in a true manner, the heart of hearts, its release. And from what? From stress, basically.
I, Yeah, speaking of stress, I
Mm-hmm.
just want to mention Donald mentioned here the lockdown in Ireland has resulted in huge numbers still fighting for the right to work from home. Did it create or expose an anxiety of interacting with colleagues? And I think that's a really interesting point because I was speaking with somebody this morning who does research into urban design and sort of the space between your home and the street. And what and I talked about this thing where we go from a box, which is the home, and then you go into the box, which is the car, to the box, which is the shops, the box, which is the work or the gym or the school or whatever it is. And then we go from one box to the other. And I think we're now so separated out. And even when you go for a walk, people have earbuds in and you can't even talk to people because they've got earbuds or they're on their phone or they're listening or whatever it is. So still there is separation. And I think what that does is create more fear of the unknown. I don't have control over it. I don't have control over it. So we had a friend here recently, a beautiful friend of mine. She has a disability though, and she loves to tidy up. And we just, I didn't have the heart to say, I don't want you to clean up, but she wouldn't ask where things would go. And I wasn't quite sure where they would land and how do we manage it and what would happen. And it wasn't unpleasant. She wasn't rude or mean or awful like that. But we had no control actually about what would happen. And it was like, okay, one more sleep and then she goes. And it was about my anxiety about not being able to control the situation. So to answer or to respond into Donald's sort of statement, his comment, did it create or expose an anxiety of interacting with colleagues? I think that for some people it's a real need, particularly women who they have a lot of domestic burdens and that's it's just more practical and causes a whole lot of other problems. But I think it did exacerbate a wedge that we can too readily step into to widen to say I want to be separate. I don't want to experience any discomfort in my life anymore.
Yeah, this is a really important thing, Wendy. This notion of boxes, I think it's a great metaphor, and the comfort zone. So get to that. I have a box. Well, our computers are boxes too, right? How many, me include, and our screens are a type of box. I actually literally have my laptop here on a box to get it higher. But it is a really great metaphor, and I make sure that I have things that I can hear the surrounding with earphones, and I don't have the wireless ones, so people can't. I don't know how many times I've been talking to people, and I didn't see that they have this little wireless earbud in, like an agent. I guess I'm too old school, but they can at least see here, and and I can hear from it. And a lot of times I will take one out, and when I walk by someone, to know that, hey, I'm open to being in the real world here, not just a virtuality in my head. So it's a really good point. And this notion of yeah, getting into creating a more of a sense of a false comfort zone and expectations. You talked about the anxiety of your friend over, and I talked about that before you came on, and how having expectations and not having them met can lead to kind of, at the very least, being upset or, agitated or annoyed that our expectations aren't met, all the way down to all this, to the root kind of fear. And yeah, how much did these lockdowns create like a comfort zone that we now don't want to get out of for some of us, But then how many people thought, oh, wow, how much should I take my life for granted? I could just kind of go do anything I wanted. Now I can't. So I'm not going to take that for granted again. I wonder about this division in people. And then what about people that it kind of brought these two into more balance and alignment? It's really interesting kind of social experiment and psychological effect it had on folks.
So I had somebody come onto our podcast for my community group. I have a podcast and I had the world's sort of number one kind of person in it. And he's a social scientist and it was so interesting. It was the most interesting way of thinking about things because we're obviously wanting to get more people biking and walking and taking public transit and all this. And he said, don't talk about bicycles or cars or transit. Just talk about you go to the doctor and you can tell the doctor there's this everybody knows there's this loneliness epidemic. Talk about how when you have more connections on the street, you reduce loneliness. It's not the only thing that causes loneliness, but it's a factor. And the other thing that he also talked about is you by nature you when you try and understand how something is, you can't include everything. Something has to go. So what do you let go actually in that trying to parse it all out? How does that work? Where do you decide this stays, that goes? What do you include? What do you exclude? And what is the cost of what you exclude? So, for instance, with cars, there's a huge number of externalities that people don't have any idea that they pay for, actually. So, we have free parking, for instance. It's not free. All your curbing and guttering, someone pays for that. It's me. I don't have a car, yet I pay for your curbing and guttering. So, and all the externalities of obesity and respiratory disease and the fish that are killed and the wildlife that are killed and by cars. It's very interesting when you start to try and figure out, well, where is the edge of something? You can't. And I think this is going back to the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, the idea of everything is dependent on everything else and everything is connected to everything else. You can't so simply define it. And also, whether it's good or bad depends on the context and the perception of how you relate to that. So, I don't know that I've answered, Donald, your thing. Did it create or expose an anxiety of interacting with colleagues? I think we have a lot of social anxieties because we don't know how to we don't know how to relate to people anymore. And I think that that's something we lost when we decided that we were separate and that we didn't have responsibility with. I think we lost good, what I call emotional manners. And how do we regain our emotional manners? And maybe that's why the mindfulness movement, whatever you may think of that, actually is beneficial for improving your emotional manners.
I haven't heard that term before. I love that, Wendy. I'm going
I
to have to
made it
remember
up.
that and use it. It's great because I'm always turned off by like hoity-toity table manners a lot, but I do feel like kind of a Neanderthal sometimes around people that are very well trained in table manners and things like this. But the emotional manners, I think, are far more important, right? Of course, how we meet the world, how we relate to the world, how we're kind to ourselves and others, compassionate to ourselves and others when it's called for. And you mentioned there, and going backwards here, this notion of how we relate to things, whether it's good or bad. maybe I would just say it a little bit differently, because then if people take that too far, then there's no good or bad in the world. It's all kind of how I am with it. And yes, how I am with it is probably more important, but I would think as a simple guide, it would be non-harm, right? The reduction of harm in the world. And then of course we can't just have that's how I see not it is or it isn't. No, we're in relation with the world and other people, right? So that's how we judge, and we can get whether something is harmful, right? Through close attention, through other people, but how we relate to whatever that is. Yeah, go ahead, Wendy. You want to say something?
Yeah, I just,
Mhm.
we are always in a place of harm, actually,
Mm,
because when you buy fruit and vegetables from the
mm,
grocer, a lot of that is made with slavery. All our equipment, our
yeah,
IT and everything like
yeah,
that, the lithium, all that's made with slavery and
yeah.
excruciating harm. If you ever buy flowers for your fiance, then that those flowers are grown and you buy them from the supermarket.
Mhm.
I mean, all that's terrible slavery and awful
Mm.
conditions. You can't actually do no harm.
Right. Then this is a very good point, Wendy. And so we can look at it like if that's the perception we're starting with, then I would say harm reduction, right? There's choices we do have. I don't have a vehicle right now. The first time I got rid of mine, first time since I was 16. I don't need one here in Europe, right? Then what was the other thing you said with the food? Well, the food, right? We've got an apple tree right outside the window, so that when I every time I take an apple from that, that's one less thing that I have to buy from the store, that I know where it's coming from. There are choices we can make to reduce harm, and what Wendy I think is pointing at is the care, right? The cares enough to know about these things, to not turn a blind eye, to be oblivious to that our choices do matter in life. We are faced with choices that some are more harmful than others, right? And so we take the notion to choose when we can less harmful choices. We go out of our way to create conditions that foster less harm, right? So yeah, this absolute thing of no harm, yes, and our intention behind it is the most important, right? Because if we act with intention to harm, then that's a problem, right? If inadvertent harm happens and we have no awareness of it, but then it's pointed out to us, well, then we can correct our behavior and make a different choice. So that's why it's very important, I feel, to be aware of our choices and the intent we're having behind our choices as well. Now, it doesn't get us off the hook just saying, "Oh, I'm going to, this will be for everybody's good," and then I just go out and harm someone. Right? It doesn't work like that either. So that's a little bit chaos or psychotic, something like that. It's not what I mean either. So it's the intentions behind our actions. And really quick with the comment of the guy you had on your podcast, I think it's a brilliant thing of what we tell people what we're for instead of what we're against. Some people say the unconscious mind doesn't know the negative. So I like when you tell kids, stop running. They don't really hear the stop so much, and they just keep running. You say slow down. We bring the solutions, like you're talking about. We focus on the solutions and not just dwell on the problems that don't really have solutions. In fact, some people say only mention the problems if there's an offered solution that goes with it. And more times than not, there's always some kind of solution to the challenges we're facing.
I think
And
it's
then I can't stress enough about how we relate to all this too. So that's where meditation, I think, can help so much too, because no matter how it is, how are we with it? You know,
Yeah. Somebody's at the door. I'm really sorry. I'll get
that's
you to
okay.
review all the things. They've just been,
Go,
just give me
Wendy.
2
Go,
seconds. I'm
go.
so sorry.
I'll read some comments. Please go. Yeah. And I will read some comments here. Miss Reed says, back here, yeah, I make good use of the time. No excuse to say I had no time to do XYZ. We all had time to do the little things. And this was from a past comment when we were talking about the lockdowns. And then Miss Reed says, Yeah, good and bad all over. Yeah, the rich got richer. That's a shame. But it taught me that we all need a way to make money, hopefully in harmony with life, no greed, fear, etc. Yeah, people were forced to look at their ways of doing things and how they earn money and how they yeah, work and things. And then here's the comment Wendy just addressed. And all right, and so Wendy, yeah, I caught you in a comment. Did you remember what you were gonna say here? It was about the expert and the relating to things. Yeah. Mm.
I guess I felt for a long time really guilty because I was creating harm. And it is really hard to realize that it doesn't matter what you do, you're always going to be creating harm. That's the thing. That's what I want to drive home.
Mm.
And to bear witness to the harm that we create actually, because we do live in a system which has harm.
Oh,
So, yeah, at its foundation, the minute one person is seen a as a resource, as a human resource, you have a system which by its nature creates harm.
this is really important, Wendy, and I want to talk too about the healthy kinds of fear. And this is the way I feel that there can actually be a fear of wrongdoing, right? That now I'm talking about the not the subtleties in the overall system where we only have so many choices, but that this healthy fear of wrongdoing, of intentionally harming and hurting, which will only hurt us too. So that's a kind of healthy fear I think we should have because if we look at some of our choices in the past for some of us, we know we've taken certain choices with certain intent and it had a certain outcome. And so then we know that way goes. So in those instances, it's healthy to have a fear, I feel, to not do that again. Now, I'm not talking about being in terror of having everything in my life right, and that I'm so in fear that thing that's going to happen to me again. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a thing that governs our speech and behavior. That's for our benefit and for the benefit of others. And but like Wendy says, there is so much. You know, this is an imperfect realm, right? That just by its very nature, there are things that need to prey on others to survive. You know, they're at every level. So to how do we not get disheartened by this, all the exploitation, all the corruption, you know, all the harm that's every day, if we look close enough we'll see, right? So this is a perception we have too, and I'm not saying delude ourselves to pretend that it's not there. No, on the contrary, this is we see things as they actually are, and then what do we do about it, right? Do we fall into a pit of despair? Do we pretend it's not there and wear rose-colored glasses? No, I feel that one of the best ways to do is actually see things for they are and work with the choices we have, the effort we have to create the conditions to reduce that harm, to act with intention, and that we are presented with sets of choices in our lives, and which is the best way, which is the best choice in any given moment, without getting overwhelmed by our sense of responsibility and that we'll make mistakes, right? Because it is a practice. But which choice do I have that will bring the least amount of harm to me and everyone else? Which choice will actually foster well-being for myself and all beings everywhere in the environment we live in? You know, so Wendy's right, and I remember the Buddha praised a lot of the Jain religion, from what I remember, for a lot of things. But one of the things he said is that it's just too extreme. Like they would hardly ever move because they didn't want to kill like tiny insects everywhere. He said that's too extreme. You can't really the quality of life around that. What really matters is our intent. We don't go stomping outside trying to kill every insect we see, right? That would be not proper, and it would be kind of pointless and a waste of time and energy anyway, you know. But if we just happen to step on something without, that's going to happen. Like Wendy says, we're just by our very nature, we're going to cause harm. But it's how is the heart? Does the heart want to do that? You know, how much effort are we giving our choices to reduce as much as possible, to create conditions, foster conditions for our well-being and that of others.
Yeah. I think I think it's life is painful.
Yes.
Life is really painful. It is painful. That's the first thing you got to know about life. It's really painful.
Yeah, and we won't, if you're in a human skin suit here, there's no way you're going to get through life without experiencing pain. End of story. There's no argument around that. But
Right.
there's certain pains that we were just born into and that have to experience. And then there's the extra layer of psychological pain on top of it that we can address, right?
Yeah.
The two arrows, right?
But I think, going back to the thread before I came on, and I'm so sorry I got my times mixed up. See, flawed being,
Life. Yeah.
and just, you were saying before, don't make the same mistake twice. I thought next time I have to really double check what the time is because I had in my mind it was, as I said, an hour later than it was. So
Make it three
there you
times.
go.
Now it's now you've got that out of the way. Don't have to worry about that and the anxiety around that anymore. Who cares? You've done that, bought the t-shirt, went home, right?
Exactly, exactly. Um, but there is something about trying to we sort of avoid feeling into life for the fear. I must say I'm very happy about Ms. Reed's engagement today. I think me coming in late actually has been really beneficial to our comments because I just love what she's writing. She's really engaged with it. It's so beautiful. But what I realized is that I spend a lot of my time trying to avoid the reality that I am going to experience pain. And so that's what I really want to step into is that, the truth is there's going to be pain and it might be regret or remorse. And you go, yeah, I'm going to learn from that lesson. I made a mistake. Look at the clock next time. It may be um, the way you use a tool, whatever. But there is also a desire to avoid stepping into that which is uncomfortable and unpleasant and living life slightly to the side for the fear that a pain may arise. And that's, I think, really hard. That's where I think the edge is. How do you step into life knowing that you will actually feel pain? I mean, you're going to feel pain, but you actually have to step into that. It sort of goes against, as my partner's son was in the army, and he said, only a crazy person goes towards someone who's going to kill you. You know, like why would you do that? It's completely against human nature. So there is something about where you kind of have to be that soldier, warrior, going towards that which is so painful, to not be afraid of that pain. But
And that's where we haven't spent any time on courage. And but this is a beautiful way. And let me just clear up some confusions on this because it's fourfold, right? We can go into things that are painful and that are beneficial for us. That's what and others. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the things that going into painful situations that aren't beneficial for us and that aren't beneficial for anyone else. So let's make that clear, right? But there's the opposite, so I'll just leave it at that because we're talking about facing the pain that we're avoiding and trying to numb out or distract ourselves from, that we would actually benefit from turning towards it, looking at it and going into it and going through it in order for our own welfare and happiness and benefit in that of others and the environment around us as well. We're not talking about kind of nihilistic, okay, I want to just go any kind of pain, screw it all, and it's actually going to make things worse. Of course, we're not talking about that. But there's the discernment to know the difference, because we have to have the discernment to know the difference of when to go into pain and what type. And some pains they aren't healthy to go into, or certain situations that cause pain and stuff like that. So, well, with that, Wendy, I think we're about ready to wrap. Any other words on courage too?
there's a word people often can use bravery and courage the same way. And they're very different words. So bravery is related to the words bravado, sort of slightly foolhardy. And courage is related, obviously, has its etymology with the word heart, cœur, the core of our being. So to me, if you step forward and you bring your heart with you into that which is a little bit challenging and kind of, I guess, painful, then coming into that space, that is courage. If you're doing that foolhardy push through, I'm going to conquer this and I'm going to get to the other side and climb that mountain no matter what it takes, well, that's bravery. And hey, there's enough broken souls in the world after bravery.
Yeah, really good point here, Wendy. So may you all have the courage to cultivate courage and face fear and know what is healthy fear and what's not. Until next time.
Until next time, thanks so Josh, and thanks for being so kind with me about my mistake on the time.
Oh, well, thanks for joining me, and no matter what the time is.